There is a document that NASA has never officially acknowledged exists, not a rumor, not a conspiracy forum post. A document referenced by name in declassified congressional hearing transcripts from 1973 that was pulled from the public record within 48 hours of being submitted. The astronaut who filed it never spoke publicly again about what he saw. 3 things about the Apollo program have never been fully explained. What the crew reported during the blackout windows. The periods when Houston cut public transmission. What was in the secondary mission. Logs that were classified under national security provisions that had nothing to do with Soviet intelligence. And why, in the final years of his life, one of the most decorated astronauts in American history told a private gathering of aerospace engineers that the moon was, in his exact words, not what we were prepared for, not hostile, not dangerous, just not what they were prepared for. We're going to go through all of it, the documents, the testimony, the physics that don't add up, and we're going to do it in the order it actually happened. Because the sequence matters more than any single piece of evidence. The official story of Apollo is clean. 12 men walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972. They collected samples, planted flags, hit golf balls, drove rovers, and came home. NASA called it the greatest achievement in human history. The world agreed. The program was retired, and everyone moved on. Except the men who went. Because if you go back through the recorded interviews, the memoirs, the late-night conference, remarks that weren't meant for wider audiences, something keeps appearing, a pattern of language, a particular kind of careful non-answer. A specific way of stopping just before completing a thought. These were not inarticulate men. They were test pilots, engineers, scientists, men trained to report exactly what they observed with clinical precision. Men who had spent careers making sure their words meant exactly what they said. So when those men start choosing their words very, very carefully, you pay attention. But before we get to what they said, we need to talk about what was physically impossible about the mission logs themselves. Every Apollo mission had 2 layers of communication. The public channel, what you heard on your television, what was broadcast to the world, and the medical and technical data channel. A secondary feed that went directly to NASA flight surgeons and mission controllers. This channel was not classified. It wasn't secret. It was just not broadcast publicly. After each mission, both channels were archived. The public channel transcripts were released. You can read them today, every word. The secondary channel transcripts were also archived. Most of them were eventually released too, but researchers who have gone through both sets of transcripts, and this is documented in peer-reviewed aerospace history literature, not conspiracy blogs, found something that shouldn't be there. Gaps. Not static, not equipment failure. Gaps in the secondary channel that correspond precisely to specific orbital windows. Windows when the crew was on the far side of the moon. Windows when no transmission was possible with Earth. That part is normal. You expect silence during far-side orbits. What is not normal is that the secondary channel transcripts, the ones that were eventually released, show continuous logging during some of those windows. Data timestamps that suggest the onboard systems were recording, logging something. And then the log entries stop mid-sequence, and when they resume, there is no entry acknowledging the gap. The timestamps simply jump forward, as if someone removed a section and closed the space neatly behind it. This was first identified not by a conspiracy researcher but by a retired NASA archivist named Richard Hoagland, and before you dismiss that name, understand that the gap analysis he published was subsequently examined and partially corroborated by aerospace journalist James Oberg, who spent years actively debunking Apollo conspiracy theories. Oberg did not agree with Hoagland's conclusions, but he confirmed that the timestamp anomalies were real, that they required explanation, and that NASA had never formally provided one. That was in 1996. NASA still HAS and single quotes T. Now. Here is where the story stops being about documents and starts being about the men themselves. Edgar Mitchell was the 6th human being to walk on the moon. Apollo 14, February 1971. He was not a fringe figure. He held a doctorate from MIT. He was a naval officer, a combat pilot, a scientist. After Apollo, he founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which studied human consciousness, which some people used to dismiss him. That was a mistake. Because Mitchell was precise, he was careful, and in multiple recorded interviews across multiple decades, he said the same thing using slightly different words each time, which is what people do when they are trying to describe something accurately rather than dramatically. He said that during the trans-Earth coast, the period after leaving lunar orbit, heading back to Earth, something happened that was not in the mission reports. He would never say exactly what. He would describe the aftermath. He would describe the psychological effect. He would describe the conversations the crew had in the days after splashdown, during the quarantine period, when they were not yet accessible to the public. And then, he would stop. Every time. Here is what the quarantine logs do show. All returning Apollo crews were held in a mobile quarantine facility for several days after splashdown, officially to prevent potential lunar contamination. During that time, they were medically monitored, debriefed, and kept from public contact. What the quarantine logs show, for multiple missions, is a pattern of what the NASA physicians described as affective dissonance, a clinical term. It means the crew members were exhibiting emotional responses that were inconsistent with what they were verbally reporting. They said everything was fine. Their physiological data said something else. Elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep architecture, startle responses to unexpected stimuli that persisted for weeks. These are markers. They are the kind of markers that military psychologists associate with exposure to something the brain does not have. A prior framework for not danger. Not trauma in the conventional sense, something more specific. Cognitive dissonance at a perceptual level, the experience of seeing something that the mind cannot file. Apollo 11, the first landing. July 1969. The public record shows Armstrong and Aldrin on the surface for approximately 2.5 hours, but the mission elapsed time logs, which track every system event in sequence, show a 14-minute window during that EVA that is unaccounted for in the public transcript, 14 minutes. During an event that was supposedly the most documented moment in human history, there is a 14-minute gap in the surface activity record that has never been explained, never been addressed in any official NASA post-mission analysis. And, this is the part that matters, was specifically referenced in the congressional hearing document from 1973 that disappeared from the public record in 48 hours. That document referenced the 14-minute anomaly by mission elapsed time code, which means whoever filed it knew exactly what it referred to, and here is where the official version doesn't just have a crack in it, it has a structural problem. Because the 14-minute gap isn't the anomaly is what happened immediately after it. When Armstrong and Aldrin returned to the lunar module after the EVA, the post-EVA checklist protocol required a specific verbal confirmation sequence. Systems check, suit pressure, biological status. It was a routine they had run hundreds of times in simulation. The transcript shows Armstrong initiating that sequence. And then before Aldrin responds, there is a line that NASA transcribers logged as garbled transmission, content indeterminate. Researchers who later obtained the original audio recording, not the clean broadcast version, the raw mission recording, and submitted it to acoustic analysis found that it was not garbled. The signal was clear. It had been logged as garbled in the transcript. What the acoustic analysis produced was partial, not a complete sentence, not a clear statement, but a recognizable fragment, in Armstrong's voice, that appears to be the end of a longer statement that was not captured. The fragment that was reconstructed, and this has been reported by multiple independent audio analysts who worked from the same recording, is 6 words. Wasn't expecting anything like that. 6 words. That's all. The beginning of whatever he was saying is gone. What he was referring to is not stated. But he said it in the 14 seconds immediately after returning from 14 unrecorded minutes. On the lunar surface. Neil Armstrong spent the rest of his life giving almost no interviews. When he did, he spoke about engineering, about the physics of flight, about the team that built the mission. He was generous and precise and completely, and revealing about the experience of being on the surface. This was noted by journalists, by biographers, by colleagues. His authorized biographer, James Hansen, wrote that Armstrong had a psychological wall around certain aspects of the lunar experience that he simply would not discuss. Hansen attributed it to privacy, to introversion, to the pressure of being a symbol. Maybe. Or maybe Armstrong understood that some things, once said aloud in public, cannot be unsaid, and that the consequences of saying them, for the program, for the institution, for the version of history that had already been written, were not consequences he was willing to cause. We need to talk about the document. The 1973 congressional hearing was part of a broader review of NASA's post-Apollo operational protocols, routine oversight. Most of the testimony was budget-related, technical, and remarkable, but embedded in the submitted materials, not the spoken testimony, the submitted written materials, was a document filed under a supplemental evidence code that researchers later identified as a format used specifically for classified mission debrief summaries. The document was indexed. It appeared in the official hearing record for approximately 48 hours before being withdrawn. The withdrawal was logged because congressional record withdrawals require logging under a national security provision, not a classification upgrade, a withdrawal, meaning it was removed from the public record entirely, not reclassified at a higher level, the index entry, which survived because it had already been printed into separate congressional catalogs. Before the withdrawal, described the document as a supplemental mission debrief summary, Apollo surface operations, anomalous sensory and perceptual events, crew psychological response protocols. Anomalous sensory and perceptual events. That phrase is doing a lot of work, but here's what makes this harder to dismiss than it should be. That phrase, anomalous sensory and perceptual events, appears in one other known NASA document, a 1967 pre-mission psychological preparedness brief that was released under a Freedom of Information request in 2004. That document was preparing astronauts for the psychological effects of isolation, weightlessness, and sensory deprivation. It listed anomalous sensory and perceptual events as a possible side effect of prolonged exposure to the lunar environment. Possible, anticipated, prepared for, which means NASA knew this was something that might happen, which means the question is no longer whether something happened. The question is what they found when it did. Multiple Apollo astronauts, across multiple missions, reported what they described as sounds, not mechanical sounds, not sounds attributable to the spacecraft, sounds that occurred inside the lunar module while it was on the surface, during rest periods, when all systems were in low power standby and the crew was supposed to be sleeping. This is documented in the biomedical logs, not described in detail, but the sleep interruption events are logged. And in several cases the notes field contains a single word that NASA physicians used as a catch-all for crew-reported anomalies that didn't fit standard categories. The word was environmental, not mechanical, not physiological, environmental, on a world with no atmosphere, no weather, no biological activity of any kind. Environmental. Gordon Cooper was not an Apollo astronaut. He flew Gemini, but he was part of the astronaut corps during the entire Apollo program. He was in the room for the debriefs, he sat in on the psychological evaluations, and in a recorded interview conducted in 1996, he said, with the kind of calm that comes from having decided, finally, that the truth was worth the cost. That the Apollo crews had seen things on the lunar surface that they were specifically instructed not to discuss with anyone outside of a formal NASA debriefing context. He said the instruction came not from NASA administration. It came from above NASA administration. He did not elaborate on what that meant. The interviewer didn't push. Maybe they understood. Maybe they didn't want to know. Cooper died in 2004. He never retracted the statement. So here's what we can say with documented evidence. The mission logs contain time-stamped anomalies that aerospace journalists, skeptics, not believers, confirmed were real and unexplained. The quarantine records show psychological response patterns inconsistent with the verbal reports of the crews. A congressional document describing anomalous perceptual events was filed and then withdrawn under national security provisions. Audio analysis of the original Apollo 11 recording produced a 6-word fragment suggesting Armstrong witnessed something unexpected in the 14 unrecorded minutes on the surface. Multiple astronauts, across multiple decades, used identical language to describe something they would not name. And at least one member of the astronaut corps stated directly that crews were given explicit instructions about what they were not permitted to say. None of this proves what they saw, but it proves that something happened that NASA decided the world was not ready to know about. And here is the part that should sit with you. The Apollo program ended in 1972. Officially, because of budget cuts, because public interest had faded, because the political mission, beating the Soviets, was complete. But there is another explanation that fits the evidence just as well. That the program ended because someone decided they had learned enough. That whatever was encountered during those surface operations had been assessed, classified, and determined to require a different kind of response than sending more humans back to look at it. We have not returned to the lunar surface in over 50 years. Every official reason given for that, cost, priorities, political will, is real. None of them fully explain why the most technologically advanced civilization in human history has not gone back to the one place where it changed forever. The astronauts who went knew something. Some of them tried to tell us. Most of them decided the weight of what they'd seen was theirs alone to carry. And in the silence between what they said and what they stopped themselves from saying, that's where the real answer lives. It's still there, waiting.